The storm devoured the mountainside. Laya's axe cleaved frozen timber, each strike puncturing the dying twilight. A knock shattered the wind's symphony. She stilled, breath ghosting in crystalline air. Through ice-etched glass, two figures emerged from the swirling void. A man draped in midnight wool, his frame bent against winter's wrath, and a child tucked beneath his shadow. The boy trembled, not merely from cold. His cough ripped through silence like splintering bone. Every nerve screamed retreat. But that sound, fractured, pleading, achingly small, obliterated walls forged through seasons of solitude. Against wisdom carved from bitter lessons, Laya's fingers traced the cold metal of the door handle. The hinges groaned as warmth rushed into the hungry night. The man straightened slowly, revealing features carved by exhaustion rather than age. His eyes held depths that spoke of privilege and power, though he carried himself like someone fleeing his own success. The child pressed closer, small fingers clutching fabric that whispered of wealth beyond Laya's understanding. Snowflakes jeweled his dark hair, and fever-bright eyes reflected vulnerability that made her chest constrict with unexpected recognition. This wasn't the first time desperation had knocked on her door, but something about these particular strangers felt different, dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical threat. "Please." The man's voice carried refinement, polished by expensive education, but roughened by genuine terror. "My son is sick. Our car died about 2 miles back, and the roads are completely blocked." He paused, studying her face with the intensity of someone unaccustomed to depending on strangers' mercy. "I know this is an imposition, but we need shelter for the night. I can compensate you generously for any inconvenience." His hand moved toward an inner pocket with practiced ease, but Laya's sharp gesture froze him mid-motion. The automatic reach for money revealed more about his character than any introduction could have managed. "Keep your wallet," she said, stepping aside to create an opening they could enter. "But if you're lying about anything at all, you'll find yourself back in that storm before you can finish your next breath." The threat carried weight earned through years of learning when compassion became foolishness. She studied his reaction carefully, noting how his shoulders relaxed when he realized she wasn't going to abandon them to the elements. The child stumbled crossing the threshold, and Laya steadied him with gentle hands that had learned to offer comfort without expecting gratitude in return. Amber light from the wood stove revealed the cabin's interior. Hand-hewn beams supporting a ceiling that had sheltered generations, air thick with scents of pine sap and old leather. Family photographs crowded the mantel, showing faces that shared Laya's storm-grey eyes and determined jawline. The man's gaze swept the space with analytical precision, but his expression softened when he noticed the child-sized rocking chair positioned near the hearth. Something about that small detail seemed to reach past his careful defenses, suggesting that beneath the expensive clothes and corporate bearing lived someone who understood what children needed from the adults responsible for their welfare. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Laya asked, crouching to meet the boy's fevered gaze. His pale cheeks bore roses painted by illness, and each breath carried a rasp that spoke of developing pneumonia. "I'm Laya, and this cabin has been keeping people safe from storms for more than 60 years. You're going to be just fine here." The child looked to his father with uncertain eyes, seeking permission to trust this stranger who smelled like wood smoke and spoke with a gentleness he'd almost forgotten existed in the world beyond corporate daycare centers and hired caregivers. "Lucas?" the boy whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm's continued assault on the windows. "I'm 8 years old, and I feel really, really sick." His honesty cut through the careful formality his father maintained, revealing raw truth beneath polished surfaces. The man, who still hadn't offered his own name, placed a protective hand on his son's shoulder, but Laya noticed how that gesture trembled with suppressed emotion. Here was a father who loved deeply, but perhaps didn't know how to express that love in ways his child could recognize and receive. The next hour transformed suspicious strangers into reluctant allies united by a child's desperate need for care. Laya moved through her domain with practiced efficiency, brewing herbal tea from plants she'd cultivated and dried herself, while heating soup that filled the cabin with aromas of genuine comfort rather than processed convenience. The unnamed man remained rigidly upright at her kitchen table, expensive coat draped around his shoulders like armor against vulnerability, watching every movement she made with the hyper-vigilance of someone who'd learned that accepting help always came with hidden costs and unexpected obligations. Lucas curled into the corner of Laya's ancient sofa, swaddled in quilts sewn by hands that had known both prosperity and poverty. His cough echoed through the cabin's intimate spaces, each spasm tightening his father's jaw with helpless frustration. "The nearest hospital is 50 miles away," Laya explained, pressing a cool cloth to the child's burning forehead with movements that spoke of long practice caring for the sick. "Even if the roads were passable, which they won't be until this storm exhausts itself, moving him now would be more dangerous than keeping him warm and comfortable here until his fever breaks naturally." "How can you possibly know that?" the man demanded, finally removing his coat to reveal a sweater that probably cost more than Laya's monthly expenses. Beneath expensive clothing, his frame carried the tension of someone who solved problems with money and authority, finding himself in a situation where neither resource offered any advantage. "Are you a medical professional of some kind?" His question held no condescension, only the desperate hope of a father seeking reassurance about his child's welfare from someone who seemed competent and caring despite their obviously modest circumstances. "My grandmother served as the closest thing this region had to a doctor for 4 decades, Laya replied, adjusting Lucas's pillows with movements that demonstrated long familiarity with sick room protocols. "She taught me to read fevers and recognize when someone needs more help than home remedies can provide. Your son has a respiratory infection, but his breathing is clear and his fever is responding to treatment. He needs rest, warmth, and time, things I can provide better than any emergency room could under these conditions." Her confidence seemed to penetrate his anxiety, offering the kind of maternal competence that money couldn't purchase or corporate authority couldn't command. The storm intensified as midnight approached, transforming the world beyond the cabin's protective walls into a wilderness that recognized no human authority or schedule. Wind drove snow against the windows with increasing fury, and temperatures dropped so rapidly that frost began forming on the glass, despite the interior's cozy warmth. The man checked his phone repeatedly, frustration mounting as he encountered the same message each time. No signal available in weather like this, in terrain where cell towers were distant luxuries that storms could render useless for days at a time. "My name is Alex," he finally admitted, as Laya prepared a makeshift bed for Lucas near the wood stove's radiating comfort. The confession emerged reluctantly, as if sharing even basic information represented a significant surrender of the privacy that wealth and position had taught him to guard carefully. "Alex Sterling. We were returning from a skiing weekend when the car started making strange noises. I pulled over to investigate, and that's when it died completely." His account carried the ring of partial truth, edited to remove details that might complicate their temporary relationship or raise questions he wasn't prepared to answer honestly. Laya nodded without pressing for elaboration, recognizing the careful omissions that marked someone with secrets worth protecting. She'd learned not to pry into strangers' business, especially those who arrived wearing clothes worth more than her annual income and speaking in the measured tones of people accustomed to having their words analyzed for legal and financial implications. "The storm's forecast to continue through tomorrow, possibly longer," she said, checking Lucas's temperature with gentle fingers. "His fever's starting to break, but he needs rest and consistent warmth. This is honestly the safest place for both of you until the weather clears and the county crews can reopen the roads." The admission that their stay would extend beyond a single night hung between them like a bridge neither was quite prepared to cross. Alex studied Laya's profile in the firelight, noting the strength in her features and the quiet confidence with which she moved through her domain. She appeared younger than his initial assessment suggested, probably mid-20s, but her eyes held wisdom that spoke of facing life's storms without the buffer of inherited wealth or corporate security. Here was someone who'd learned to create comfort from simple materials and find contentment in circumstances that would have challenged his ability to cope even temporarily. As the night deepened, an unexpected rhythm emerged within the cabin's close quarters. Laya moved between kitchen and living areas, preparing food and monitoring Lucas's condition with natural grace that spoke of years spent caring for others as a matter of course, rather than professional obligation. Alex found himself studying her hands as she worked, capable fingers that had learned to create warmth from wood and healing from herbs, nails kept short for practical reasons rather than fashion, skin that had known honest labor under open skies rather than the artificial environments that shaped his daily existence. Lucas's breathing gradually eased as herbal treatments and consistent warmth worked their gentle magic, and his fever-bright eyes began focusing with increasing clarity on his surroundings. "Miss Laya," he said, voice still weak, but no longer carrying the desperate rasp that had alarmed his father throughout their desperate journey. "Do you live here all by yourself? Aren't you ever scared?" The question carried childhood's innocent directness, cutting through adult pretense to reach truths that polite conversation typically avoided addressing with such uncomfortable honesty. "Sometimes," Laya admitted, settling into the chair beside his makeshift sick bed with the ease of someone comfortable discussing difficult topics with children. "But being scared and being alone are different things entirely. I chose to live here because it feels like home, not because I'm running away from anything I can't handle." Her answer was intended for the child, but she felt Alex's attention sharpen as he registered the subtle distinction she'd drawn between solitude and isolation, between choosing independence and having it forced upon you by circumstances beyond your control. The first night passed slowly, marked by Lucas's steadily improving condition and the gradual easing of tension between three people thrust together by forces none of them could influence or escape. Alex found himself relaxing incrementally, his corporate armor softening as he watched Laya care for his son with the kind of attention that couldn't be purchased or commanded through any amount of money or authority. She read to Lucas from well-worn books, her voice painting pictures of adventures that made the child's eyes light up with wonder despite his lingering weakness and the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Morning arrived grey and bitter, revealing a landscape transformed by wind and snow into something both magnificent and treacherous. The storm had sculpted drifts against the cabin's walls that reached nearly to the windows, and the access road had disappeared beneath a blanket of white that would require professional equipment and favorable weather to clear safely. Alex stood at the kitchen window, coffee steaming between his palms, watching the continued snowfall with the expression of someone accustomed to controlling his environment, finding himself completely subject to nature's unpredictable authority. "The car's completely buried by now," Laya observed, joining him at the window with her own mug cradled between hands that had grown calloused from splitting wood and hauling water from the well. "Even if the engine could be repaired, we couldn't extract it until the county crews finish with the main roads, and that won't happen until the storm stops completely and they can assess the damage safely." She sipped her coffee and studied his profile, noting the persistent tension that never quite left his shoulders even during sleep, as if responsibility was a weight he'd learned to carry, but never quite learned to set down. Lucas emerged from his nest of quilts looking pale but markedly improved, his fever finally broken and his breathing clear for the first time since their arrival. "Daddy?" he said, tugging at Alex's sweater with small hands that had regained their strength overnight. "Can we stay here longer? Miss Laya promised to show me how to carve a whistle from birch wood, and she makes the best pancakes I've ever tasted." The child's enthusiasm carried an undertone of longing that made both adults uncomfortable for different reasons. Alex because he recognized his son's hunger for the kind of domestic stability money couldn't purchase, and Laya because she was beginning to understand how much she'd missed having people to care for. The second day unfolded with a domesticity that felt both foreign and strangely natural to all three inhabitants of the snowbound cabin. Alex discovered muscles he'd forgotten he possessed as he helped Laya split wood and carry supplies from the storage shed that hugged the cabin's north wall like a protective embrace. His hands, more accustomed to keyboards and fountain pens, blistered quickly from the axe handle, but he persisted with the same methodical determination that had built his business empire from inherited potential into actual achievement. Laya watched him work with growing respect, noting how he approached physical labor with the same analytical intensity that marked everything he did. His technique was initially clumsy, but improved rapidly, and she found herself appreciating his willingness to learn, despite obvious unfamiliarity with such tasks. "You're getting better," she said, demonstrating the proper stance for maximum efficiency with minimum strain on his back and shoulders. "But you're still working too hard. Let the weight of the axe do most of the work, and save your energy for accuracy rather than power." Their hands touched briefly as she adjusted his grip, and both froze at the unexpected intimacy of the contact. Lucas appointed himself supervisor of all cabin activities, chattering constantly as his strength returned and his natural curiosity emerged from beneath fever-induced lethargy. He followed Laya everywhere, absorbed in her explanations of how things worked in a world without delivered groceries or instant access to every convenience. "Why don't you have a dishwasher?" he asked, standing on a chair to help dry dishes with a towel nearly as large as himself, his questions revealing the gulf between his normal life and her chosen simplicity with innocent directness that made both adults acutely aware of their different circumstances. "Because washing dishes by hand gives you time to think about important things," Laya replied, noting how the child's curiosity revealed not spoiled entitlement, but genuine interest in understanding different ways of living. "And because some tasks are worth doing slowly, with attention to each step, rather than rushing through them to get to the next item on your list." She handed him another plate to dry, watching as he approached the chore with the same careful concentration his father brought to learning how to split wood properly and efficiently. The afternoon brought a temporary break in the storm's intensity, and Laya seized the opportunity to venture outside and check on her small flock of chickens housed in a coop attached to the storage shed. Alex and Lucas followed, the child delighted by his first encounter with actual farm animals, and his father studying everything with the analytical gaze that evaluated investments and market opportunities. The chickens seemed remarkably unconcerned by the blizzard conditions, pecking at grain Laya scattered across the coop floor with the kind of focused determination that reminded Alex uncomfortably of his own single-minded pursuit of business objectives. "They're so much smaller than I expected," Lucas exclaimed, watching the hens with fascination that made his father smile, despite the complexity of emotions swirling beneath the surface of their temporary domestic arrangement. "And they make such funny noises when they eat." His laughter rang clear in the cold air, drawing genuine smiles from both adults, despite the uncertainty that marked every aspect of their situation. Alex pulled out his phone to capture a photograph of his son's delight, then paused when he realized the device still showed no signal bars, a reminder that their isolation from his normal world remained complete and potentially problematic. The cell tower serves the entire valley from the peak about 15 miles east, Laya explained, noticing his frustration with their continued disconnection from the outside world. During storms like this, you might get a signal occasionally if you climb to the ridgeline, but it's not reliable and certainly not worth the risk in these conditions. She watched his face carefully, noting how the technological isolation seemed to both agitate and somehow relieve him, as if being unreachable carried both burden and unexpected freedom from obligations he couldn't postpone indefinitely. Evening brought them together around the dinner table Laya had inherited along with the cabin, its surface scarred by decades of family meals and marked by ring stains from countless cups of coffee shared during morning conversations that stretched into afternoon philosophy sessions. The simple meal of venison stew and fresh bread felt more substantial than many elaborate dinners Alex had attended in restaurants where individual courses cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. And he found himself savoring each bite with attention that surprised him with its intensity and focus. Lucas filled the silence between spoonfuls with stories from school and observations about life in the cabin that revealed both his intelligence and his hunger for the kind of ordinary family interactions he'd been missing. "Miss Laya," he said, pointing to a watercolor painting hanging near the kitchen window. "Did you paint that picture of the mountain? It looks like the same one we can see from here, but the colors are different." His observation sparked a conversation about art and perception that lasted long after the dishes were cleared away and put back in their proper places. "My mother painted that the summer before I was born," Laya explained, her voice carrying the kind of warmth reserved for precious memories that had been polished by years of retelling and remembering. "She said she wanted me to see the mountain through her eyes before I learned to see it through my own. The colors aren't exactly realistic, but they capture the way light can transform stone into something magical if you know how to look for the beauty hidden beneath the surface." The painting showed their eastern horizon rendered in purples and golds that spoke more of emotion than literal representation, transforming familiar geography into something transcendent and spiritual. Alex studied the artwork with growing appreciation, recognizing the skill required to capture both physical detail and emotional resonance in watercolor's demanding and unforgiving medium. "She was genuinely talented," he said quietly, his comment revealing an aesthetic sensitivity that surprised Laya, who had begun thinking of him primarily in terms of corporate efficiency and material success. You can see the love she invested in every brushstroke, the way she transformed a simple landscape into something that speaks to the heart rather than just the eyes. His unexpected insight into artistic expression suggested depths beneath his business-focused exterior that made her curious about the man he might be when not weighted down by professional responsibilities. The second night passed more easily than the first, with Lucas sleeping soundly in his nest of quilts, and the adults sharing conversation that gradually moved beyond careful politeness toward something approaching genuine friendship. Alex found himself talking about fatherhood in ways he'd never articulated before, admitting fears and uncertainties that had no place in boardroom discussions or strategic planning sessions where vulnerability was perceived as weakness rather than honesty about the human condition and its inherent challenges. "I worry constantly that I'm failing him in ways I don't even recognize," he confessed as they sat before the dying fire, the cabin quiet except for Lucas's steady breathing and the wind's continued song outside the windows. "His mother died when he was 5, and I responded by burying myself in work instead of learning how to be both parents to a child who needed more than money and good schools. The admission cost him something significant, this man who had built an empire on never showing weakness or uncertainty to competitors, who would exploit any perceived vulnerability without hesitation or mercy. Laya studied his profile in the shifting firelight, noting the genuine anguish that tightened the corners of his eyes when he spoke about his relationship with his son. "Love isn't about being perfect," she said finally, her words carrying the weight of someone who had learned about affection through loss rather than abundance. "It's about being present when it matters most, and you're here now, in this moment, putting his needs ahead of whatever business crisis might be waiting for your attention back in your normal world." Her observation seemed to reach something deep in his chest, offering absolution he hadn't known he needed for sins he'd been carrying like stones in his pockets. The third morning dawned clear and bitter, with sunlight transforming the snow-covered landscape into a crystalline wonderland that made Lucas gasp with delight when he pressed his face against the cabin's frost-etched windows. The storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world sculpted by wind and cold into something both beautiful and treacherous. Alex stood at the kitchen counter helping Laya prepare breakfast, while Lucas drew pictures at the table with colored pencils she'd discovered in a drawer filled with forgotten childhood treasures and half-finished art projects that spoke of creative ambitions set aside for more practical concerns. "Look, Daddy," Lucas called, holding up his latest creation with obvious pride and excitement. "I drew our family in the cabin." The picture showed 3 stick figures standing before a rectangle topped with a triangle, smoke curling from a chimney drawn with such enthusiasm that it dominated the upper portion of the paper. But it was the way he'd positioned the figures that made both adults pause in their morning preparations, close together, holding hands, with smiles that radiated happiness and contentment that seemed almost too pure for the complex realities that shaped their actual circumstances. Alex knelt beside his son's chair, studying the drawing with an intensity that spoke of its unexpected auctional impact on someone who thought he'd learned to protect himself from hope. "It's absolutely beautiful, Lucas," he said, his voice slightly rough with suppressed feeling that threatened to overwhelm the careful control he'd maintained since arriving at Laya's door. "You've captured something very special here, something I'm not sure I would have been able to see without your help." The child beamed at the praise, but it was Laya's reaction that held Alex's attention, the way her breath caught slightly and her eyes softened as she looked at the representation of their temporary family unit. "Can I keep this?" she asked Lucas, her question surprising both father and son with its genuine emotion and obvious desire to preserve something that would outlast their brief time together. "I'd like to hang it right here by the window, where I can see it every morning when I drink my coffee and remember what it felt like to have a family again, even if it was only for a few days." The offer delighted the child and created a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance, linking them through shared experience and mutual affection in ways that corporate strategy couldn't achieve and money couldn't duplicate or replace. Hours passed with increasing awareness that their isolation was temporary and would soon end through no choice of their own. The sun's warmth had begun the gradual process of melting the massive snow drifts, and the wind had died to occasional gusts that no longer threatened to tear shingles from the cabin's roof or drive snow through the smallest gaps in window frames. Alex found himself dreading the return to his normal world with an intensity that surprised him, while Laya struggled with emotions she'd thought were safely buried beneath layers of protective independence and carefully maintained emotional distance from temporary connections. Lucas seemed to sense the approaching change in their circumstances and grew increasingly clingy as the afternoon progressed, following both adults with the determination of someone trying to memorize every moment before it disappeared forever. "When we have to leave?" he asked Laya as she taught him to braid strips of leather into a bookmark he could take with him. "Will you forget about us completely? Will you pretend we were never here?" The question carried the weight of a child's fundamental fear of abandonment, but also revealed the depth of connection he'd formed during their brief time together in circumstances that had stripped away pretense and revealed authentic affection. Never, Laya promised with a fervor that surprised her with its intensity and conviction. You've both given me something precious that I thought I'd lost forever. The reminder that home isn't just a place you live, it's the people who make you feel safe and loved and understood. Her words created a moment of profound silence in the cabin's warm interior, broken only by the soft crackling of logs in the wood stove and the distant sound of melting snow dripping from the eaves in rhythms that marked time's steady passage toward inevitable separation. Alex watched this exchange with growing realization that their brief sanctuary had become something none of them had expected, a glimpse of life as it could be rather than life as it was. The cabin had stripped away the complications of his corporate existence and revealed possibilities he'd stopped believing were available to someone with his level of responsibility and commitment to obligations that extended far beyond personal happiness. But the world beyond these protective walls waited with demands that couldn't be ignored indefinitely, no matter how much he might wish for time to stop in this perfect moment. Evening brought the distant sound of heavy machinery, county snowplows beginning their work on main roads, though the access route to Laya's cabin would require another day or two before becoming passable for ordinary vehicles. Alex spent increasing time on his phone as intermittent signal became available, and Laya watched his gradual transformation back into the businessman he'd been before the storm forced him into her world. Each conversation was brief but intense, conducted in corporate shorthand that excluded outsiders from understanding their full significance or the decisions being made in rapid-fire exchanges. The calls seemed to rebuild walls that had crumbled during their days of enforced simplicity, and she found herself mourning the loss of the man who had learned to split wood and laugh at his son's jokes without calculating the opportunity cost of every moment spent away from business obligations. Fragments of his conversations reached her, mentions of meetings missed, deals requiring immediate attention, people who needed decisions that only he could make. The language of power and responsibility gradually reclaimed the space that domestic intimacy had briefly occupied. Lucas sensed the change in his father's demeanor and grew quiet, returning to the withdrawn behavior that had marked his illness during their first desperate night in the cabin. "Are we leaving tomorrow, Daddy?" he asked during dinner, his voice small and uncertain in ways that hadn't been present during the middle days of their stay. "Do we have to go back to the big house where Mrs. Henderson watches me while you work late every night?" The question revealed details about their normal life that made Laya understand why the child had flourished so completely during their brief time together in circumstances that had allowed his father to be fully present. "Yes, buddy," Alex replied, though his tone carried reluctance that didn't escape either of his listeners despite his attempt to sound matter-of-fact about their inevitable departure. "We have responsibilities waiting for us, people who are counting on us to be where we're supposed to be when we're supposed to be there." The explanation was logical and mature, but it failed to address the emotional reality of leaving behind something that had felt more like home than anywhere either of them had been in recent memory. The final night in the cabin passed slowly, marked by an undercurrent of sadness that none of them wanted to acknowledge directly or discuss in terms that might make their separation more difficult than it already promised to be. Lucas fell asleep between Laya and Alex on the old sofa, exhausted by the emotional weight of impending loss and lulled by quiet conversation that flowed around him like a protective cocoon woven from words and shared understanding. The adults found themselves talking in whispers, reluctant to break the spell that had transformed three strangers into something resembling a family unit. "I want you to know," Alex said, as they carefully moved the sleeping child to his makeshift bed near the wood stove's dying warmth, "that these days have been the most genuine I've felt in years. You've given us both something irreplaceable, something I don't think I even knew we were missing until we found it here." His words carried the weight of someone trying to capture the essence of experience before it slipped away like melting snow, but also the resignation of someone who believed that some things were too precious and fragile to survive contact with ordinary reality and its harsh demands. Morning arrived with the sound of motors struggling through heavy snow. The county road crew had reached the turnoff to Laya's access road and begun the process of clearing the path that would return Alex and Lucas to their normal world beyond the mountains. The mechanical roar shattered the cabin's peaceful atmosphere like artillery fire, announcing that their refuge had become penetrable once again, and that the demands of ordinary life could no longer be held at bay by weather or distance or wishful thinking about time standing still. Alex spent the morning arranging for a rental car to be delivered as soon as the road became passable, coordinating his return to corporate responsibilities that had been accumulating during his absence, like snow drifting against a closed door. Laya watched the transformation with growing sadness, seeing the man who had learned to find joy in simple tasks disappear beneath layers of professional obligation and strategic thinking that left little room for the spontaneous laughter that had marked their middle days together in enforced intimacy. Lucas refused to pack his few belongings, insisting that leaving them in the cabin meant they would have reason to return someday soon. "My toothbrush wants to stay here," he announced, with the kind of logic that made perfect sense to an 8-year-old, but broke both adults' hearts with its transparent hope and desperate attempt to create permanence from temporary circumstances. "And my extra socks are friends with Miss Laya's socks now, so they shouldn't have to be separated when they're just getting to know each other properly." The rental car arrived just after noon, delivered by a driver who had struggled through partially cleared roads to reach the remote cabin that had served as their sanctuary from the storm and from the complications of their regular lives. Alex loaded their minimal luggage with movements that spoke of reluctance rather than eagerness to resume his normal existence in corporate towers and boardrooms where decisions affected thousands of people, but rarely included the kind of personal satisfaction he'd discovered during their brief domestic interlude. Lucas clung to Laya with desperate intensity, trying to memorize the feeling of unconditional acceptance and genuine affection that had flourished in the cabin's intimate atmosphere. "I'll never forget you," he whispered against her shoulder as she knelt to hug him goodbye, with equal reluctance to release him back to a world that seemed cold and distant compared to the warmth they'd created together. "You're the best almost mommy anyone could ever have, and I'm going to draw pictures of you every day so I don't forget what you look like when you smile." Alex approached more slowly, carrying an envelope he'd sealed after writing something during the early morning hours when sleep had proven impossible due to the weight of impending separation. "I can't adequately thank you for what you've done for us," he said, his corporate polish failing to mask genuine emotion that threatened to overwhelm his careful control. "Please take this, not as payment, because what you've given us can't be purchased, but as insurance that angels shouldn't have to worry about practical concerns when they're busy saving people who desperately need saving." Laya accepted the envelope without opening it, sensing that examining its contents while they were still present would somehow diminish the purity of what they'd shared by introducing monetary calculations into emotional territory that felt sacred and separate from ordinary transactions. Instead, she focused on memorizing Alex's face, storing away the way his eyes had learned to soften when he looked at his son, and the rare smiles that had transformed his features from merely handsome to genuinely beautiful, in ways that had nothing to do with genetic lottery and everything to do with authentic happiness. The departure itself was swift, as if prolonging the goodbye would make it unbearable for everyone involved in the painful process of separation. Lucas pressed his face against the car's rear window, waving frantically until the vehicle disappeared around the bend that would take them back to main roads and eventually to the world that had shaped them before the storm brought them to her door seeking shelter they hadn't known they needed. Laya stood in the sudden silence, watching the empty road and feeling the cabin's walls close around her like an embrace that had lost its source of warmth. The envelope remained unopened on the kitchen table through dinner and into the evening, its presence both comforting and somehow threatening in ways she couldn't articulate or understand. Finally, as the fire burned low and the cabin settled into nighttime rhythms that felt too quiet after days filled with conversation and laughter, Laya broke the seal and discovered not just a substantial check made out in Alex's careful handwriting, but also a business card that made her hands shake with sudden understanding of how completely she had misjudged the man who had learned to split wood beside her. The card identified Alex as Alexander Sterling, Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Enterprises, with corporate headquarters in Denver and satellite offices spanning multiple states. The company name meant nothing to Laya's limited business knowledge, but the title and professional presentation made clear that her storm-blown visitors had been far more significant in the corporate world than she'd imagined possible. The check represented more money than she'd seen in her entire life, but it was Alex's brief note that struck her with genuine shock and growing realization of the gulf between their circumstances. "Your kindness saved more than our lives during that storm," Alex had written in handwriting that spoke of expensive education and practiced authority over complex business decisions. "You reminded us what home could feel like, and what love looks like when it's given freely rather than earned through achievement or purchased through success. I don't expect to see you again, but I hope you'll use this to build the life you deserve in the place that makes you happy, surrounded by the kind of peace that money can't buy, but kindness can create." 3 months passed in isolation that felt both familiar and fundamentally changed, as if the storm had altered not just the landscape, but also the essential character of the place she'd called home for years without questioning whether solitude was choice or habit. Laya returned to routines that had sustained her before Alex and Lucas arrived, but everything felt muted now, like colors that had faded or music played at volume too low to properly hear. The general store where she'd worked closed permanently, leaving her without income just as winter's grip tightened around the mountain communities that depended on seasonal tourism and summer construction work for economic survival. The check remained uncashed in the kitchen drawer, too significant to ignore, but too complicated to simply deposit and spend, without feeling like she was somehow betraying the purity of what they'd shared during those perfect days when wealth hadn't mattered and love had felt possible despite impossible circumstances. She understood that Alex had meant it as gift rather than payment, but accepting such substantial assistance would create obligations that felt wrong given the authentic affection that had developed between them during circumstances that had stripped away pretense and revealed genuine caring. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late March, delivered by postal service along with bills and advertisements that marked her tenuous connection to the wider world beyond the mountain peaks that had always defined the boundaries of her existence. The envelope bore Sterling Enterprises logo and Alex's name in the return address, but the handwriting was different, more precise, less personal, suggesting that someone else had been tasked with maintaining whatever connection remained between them across the months of separation and silence. Inside, Laya found a formal invitation printed on paper heavy enough to suggest expense and attention to detail that spoke of corporate events designed to impress rather than simply inform. Sterling Enterprises was hosting a fundraising gala to support a new charitable foundation focused on helping rural families during crisis situations, and her presence was specifically requested as an honored guest whose recent contributions to the Sterling family, had provided inspiration for the organization's mission and operational philosophy. A handwritten note was attached to the invitation, brief but unmistakably from Alex himself, despite the months that had passed since their last communication. "Lucas asks about you every day," he'd written in the careful script she remembered from his goodbye letter. "This foundation was inspired by your example of helping others without expecting anything in return. It wouldn't feel right to launch it without you there to see what grew from the seeds you planted during the storm. Please come. We'd both like the chance to thank you properly for everything you gave us when we needed it most." The gala took place in a hotel ballroom that could have contained her entire cabin several times over, with decorations that probably cost more than most families earned in a year, and guests whose casual jewelry represented small fortunes. Laya felt conspicuous among people whose wealth was measured in millions rather than hundreds, but she moved through the crowd with quiet confidence that came from knowing she belonged there by invitation rather than accident or misunderstanding about her circumstances. Alex spotted her across the crowded ballroom before she saw him, and she watched his face transform with genuine pleasure that made the long drive and careful attention to her appearance worthwhile despite her discomfort with such ostentatious display of wealth. He excused himself from conversations with people who looked like they appeared regularly in business magazines, crossing the room with focused attention that made other guests step aside without conscious thought or apparent resentment of the interruption. "You came," he said simply, and the warmth in his voice carried her back to quiet evenings beside the wood stove, when conversation had flowed as naturally as breathing between people who had learned to appreciate each other's company without pretense or calculation. "I wasn't entirely sure you would." He looked older somehow, more polished, but also more tired, as if success required constant vigilance that left little energy for the kind of spontaneous joy she remembered from their cabin days when responsibilities had been reduced to basic survival and mutual care. Lucas appeared at his father's side with the kind of timing that suggested he'd been watching for her arrival with the same intensity his father had shown, his face lighting up with pure delight that made every adult in the vicinity smile reflexively at such uninhibited happiness. He'd grown during their months apart, but his enthusiasm remained unchanged as he launched into detailed accounts of school adventures and careful descriptions of the foundation work that would help families like the ones they'd met during their mountain isolation. The evening concluded with speeches about corporate responsibility and community support. But for Laya, the real significance lay in quiet moments. Lucas showing her the painted wooden box he'd made as a gift, Alex's genuine smile when he looked at his son, and the easy conversation that flowed between them, despite months of separation and the vast differences in their daily circumstances. The foundation being launched that night would provide emergency assistance to rural families facing crisis situations, using Sterling Enterprises resources to create the kind of support network that could have helped during her parents' final illnesses. "This was your inspiration?" Alex said quietly during the formal presentations, his voice pitched for her ears alone, despite the ballroom's elegant acoustics and hundreds of other conversations occurring simultaneously around them. "Everything we're doing here tonight comes from watching how you helped us when we needed it most, sharing what you had without expecting anything in return. That's the model we want to follow as we try to help other families who find themselves in circumstances beyond their immediate control." Months passed in a rhythm that felt both familiar and subtly altered, as if the gala had shifted something fundamental in Laya's understanding of what was possible in her life beyond the mountain boundaries that had always seemed permanent and unchangeable. She began working with the Sterling Foundation on consulting basis, traveling to rural communities and developing programs that provided assistance without undermining the independence that mountain families valued above almost everything else, including immediate comfort or financial security. The work proved both challenging and deeply satisfying, connecting her with families who faced the same kinds of struggles she'd experienced while giving her resources to make genuine differences in their outcomes and long-term prospects for stability. Alex and Lucas visited the cabin regularly, transforming weekend trips into family time that built on the foundation of their storm-born connection while creating new memories that belonged to their chosen relationship rather than circumstances beyond anyone's immediate control. 2 years after the storm that brought them together, Alex proposed during a summer evening spent on Laya's front porch, with Lucas serving as enthusiastic accomplice who had helped choose the ring and plan the surprise with the same attention to detail his father brought to major business decisions. The proposal itself was simple and heartfelt, acknowledging both the journey they'd traveled together and the future they wanted to build as family unit that honored their individual strengths while creating something stronger than the sum of their separate parts. The wedding took place the following spring in the meadow behind Laya's cabin, with mountain peaks serving as backdrop, and the extended community of families they'd helped through foundation work serving as witnesses to their commitment. Lucas served as ring-bearer with the same pride he'd shown in every aspect of their growing family, and the ceremony itself reflected values they'd discovered together: simplicity, authenticity, and understanding that true wealth lay in connections that couldn't be purchased or lost through economic circumstances beyond individual control. Years passed, and their story became part of local folklore, an example of how kindness could transform lives and how love could bridge any gap when based on genuine respect and shared values rather than convenience or calculation. The Sterling Foundation grew from small regional program into national model for community-based assistance, but its heart remained the simple truth Laya had demonstrated during Winter Storm, that helping others was both privilege and responsibility, and that home was anywhere people chose to care for each other with open hearts and willing hands extended in friendship rather than mere obligation.